The moment Tobias Norris rode into the town of Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, 3 different men warned him about Beatrice Hawkins before he had even tied his horse to the post outside the Silver Spur saloon, and not a single one of those warnings made him want to turn his horse around. He had been riding for 11 days straight from Wichita, carrying a letter of introduction from a cattle broker named Edmund Fisk, who had told him that the Hawkins Ranch outside of Caldwell was the finest operation in all of Sumner County, run with an iron will and a sharp eye that most men in the territory could not match. Fisk had described the ranch in glowing terms, speaking of the herd size and the quality of the stock, the way the land rolled south toward the Oklahoma border in long, golden waves of grass that fed cattle better than anywhere else in the state. He had spoken of all of that with obvious admiration, but when Tobias had asked who ran the place, Fisk had paused in a way that told him everything. "A woman," Fisk had said, "name of Beatrice Hawkins. Her father passed 2 winters ago and left it all to her, which caused quite a stir, as you might imagine. She is capable, more than capable, but she is proud to a fault, Mr. Norris, and that pride has cost her more than one good partnership. Men come out to work with her and they leave within the season because she will not hear a word of disagreement without taking it as a personal insult." Tobias had listened to all of that, had folded the letter of introduction into his coat pocket, and had simply said, "Much obliged," before riding out of Wichita the following morning. Now, standing outside the Silver Spur with dust still settling off his coat and his hat pulled low against the Kansas wind, he heard it all again in different words. The first man was a weather-beaten fellow named Cobb, who leaned against the post with a toothpick between his teeth and shook his head when Tobias mentioned where he was headed. "Hawkins' place," Cobb said. "You going out to offer a partnership?" "Something like that," Tobias said. "Good luck to you. Last 3 men who tried that left before the leaves turned. She runs that ranch like it is the only thing on earth worth running, and she does not take kindly to being told there is another way to do something." The second warning came from the barkeep inside the saloon, a round-faced man named Greer who poured Tobias a whiskey without being asked and said, "You got that look about you. You are headed out to the Hawkins spread. Is it that obvious? Every man who rides in from the east with a letter in his pocket and a good horse ends up there sooner or later. Word has gotten around that the Hawkins land is prime, but word has also gotten around about the woman herself. She will not be told anything, friend. She has got more pride than the whole county put together, and she wears it like armor." The third warning came from a young cowhand sitting at a corner table, no older than 22, who looked at Tobias with something between sympathy and amusement. "I worked her place for 4 months last year," he said. "She is not mean. I want to be fair about that. She is not cruel or unkind. She is just absolutely certain that she is right about everything all the time, and she has been right enough times that nobody can say she is not. But it wears on a man, working for someone who does not leave room for anyone else to have a thought worth hearing." Tobias drank his whiskey slowly, looking out the window at the wide Kansas street with its churned mud and the distant line of cottonwood trees along the creek. He thought about Edmund Fisk's letter. He thought about why he had come all this way. He had been working cattle partnerships and land negotiations across 3 states for the better part of 6 years, ever since he had sold his own spread in Missouri at the age of 28, and decided that the future was not in one piece of land, but in building something larger, something that could weather the seasons and the markets and the unpredictable turns that the cattle trade took with alarming regularity. He was 34 now, and he had built a modest fortune not by owning land, but by knowing which land was worth investing in and who was worth building with. He set his glass down and pulled some coins from his vest pocket and placed them on the bar. "Much obliged for the whiskey and the counsel," he said, "but I have been looking for someone worth being proud beside for a good while now. I believe I will go and introduce myself." He heard Cobb laugh from somewhere behind him as he pushed through the swinging doors, but he did not stop. He untied his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Calhoun, and rode south out of Caldwell into the great rolling plain toward the Hawkins ranch. The road south from Caldwell was not much of a road at all, more of a two-track trail worn into the grass by years of wagon wheels and cattle drives. But it led him true, and within an hour he could see the ranch in the distance. A cluster of buildings settled into a shallow draw with a windmill turning slowly above it, and a line of cottonwoods along a creek to the east. The main house was a two-story frame structure, newer than he had expected, with a proper porch running the full length of the front and a kitchen addition off the back that someone had added with care. The barn was large and well-maintained, the fences straight and tight. Even from a distance he could see that this place was run by someone who paid attention. He came through the gate and was met in the yard by a lean old hand with a gray beard and suspicious eyes, who stepped out from the barn and looked him over without saying a word. "Morning," Tobias said. "My name is Tobias Norris. I have a letter of introduction for Miss Hawkins from Edmund Fisk in Wichita. I am hoping she will see me." The old hand looked at the letter Tobias extended toward him, did not take it, and said, "She is in the far pasture checking the fence line on the south quarter. If you ride out that way you will find her, but I would suggest you do not sneak up on her. She does not like to be startled, and she is an excellent shot." "I will announce myself clearly," Tobias said, and he meant it. He rode south through the home pasture, where fat cattle grazed on spring grass that was already thick and green, and he could see the difference in the quality of the herd even from horseback. These were not trail-worn longhorns but well-bred stock, carrying more weight than most Kansas cattle he had seen, their hides clean and their condition excellent. Someone had been making careful breeding decisions here for years. He felt his estimation of the operation go up several notches. He found her a half-mile south of the main buildings, kneeling beside a section of fence where a post had listed to one side and was threatening to drag the wire down. She had a mallet in one hand and a leather-work glove on the other, and she was driving the post back to true with efficient, unhesitating strokes, her dark hair caught at the back of her neck, and a wide-brimmed hat pushed back on her head. She was wearing a canvas work coat over a plain dress, practical and unadorned, and she did not look up when she heard him coming because she had clearly heard him coming for some time. "If you are selling something," she said, still driving the post, "I am not buying." "I am not selling anything," Tobias said, pulling Calhoun up at a respectful distance. "My name is Tobias Norris. I have a letter from Edmund Fisk in Wichita. He suggested I come speak with you about a potential arrangement regarding your cattle operation." She drove the post one more time, tested it with her hand, found it satisfactory, and then rose to her feet and turned to face him. He had not known what to expect exactly, but what he saw was a woman of perhaps 27 or 28 with dark eyes that assessed him with absolute frankness, and a face that was handsome rather than soft, all clean angles and a firm set to her mouth. She was tall for a woman, and she carried herself in the way of someone who had spent years being the tallest person in the room in terms of authority if not always in height, someone who had learned early that the space she occupied was hers by right and not by permission. She took the letter he extended, peeled off her glove, and read it without hurry. He watched her read it and noticed that her eyes moved steadily through the lines without the self-conscious performance of someone who knew they were being watched. She was simply reading the letter because it deserved to be read properly. "Edmund Fisk," she said when she had finished. "He is a fair man. What is your proposition, Mr. Norris? I represent a group of investors based out of Wichita and Kansas City who are looking to place capital in established cattle operations in Sumner County, not to purchase land or take control of operations, but to provide capital for herd expansion in exchange for a percentage of the profits over a 5-year period. Your operation comes highly recommended as one of the strongest in the county." She folded the letter and handed it back to him. "And what percentage are these investors expecting?" 30% of net profits over 5 years, with the option to renegotiate at the end of the term. 20%, she said without blinking. And the renegotiation option applies to both parties. He had not expected her to counter so quickly or so cleanly. He had dealt with ranchers who hemmed and deliberated and wanted 3 meetings before they would commit to a number. And he had dealt with ranchers who tried to bluster their way through negotiations with bluff and noise. She had simply heard the offer, calculated what was fair, and stated her counter as if it were obvious, which, he realized after thinking about it for a moment, it essentially was. 25%, he said, and you choose the schedule of any herd expansion. No investor input on operational decisions. She looked at him for a long moment. The Kansas wind moved through the grass around them, and the cattle in the distance moved their slow, bovine way across the pasture, and somewhere a meadowlark was singing its liquid, rising song. "Come to the house," she said. "We will discuss the details." He followed her back across the pasture toward the ranch buildings, and he noticed the way the land responded to how it had been managed, the even coverage of the grass, the lack of the overgrazing that was so common on other spreads, the careful placement of the water tanks he could see at intervals across the range. Someone here had thought about this land as a long-term proposition and had managed it accordingly. The house was clean and functional inside, without the ornament that some ranch houses affected, but with a particular kind of order that spoke of someone who knew what they needed and saw no reason to clutter it with anything more. There was a large oak table in the main room that served clearly as both dining table and working desk, covered at one end with neat stacks of ledger books and papers. She set water on the stove and sat across from him at the clear end of the table, and they talked for 3 hours. In those 3 hours, Tobias learned several things. He learned that Beatrice Hawkins had been running this ranch since she was 25 years old when her father, a man named Henry Hawkins, who had built the operation from nothing in the years just after the war, had died of pneumonia in December of 1875. He learned that she had a foreman named Walt Briggs, who was the gray-bearded man in the yard, and 3 regular hands and a cook named Rosa, who was Mexican, and had been with the family since Beatrice was a child. He learned that she had been in negotiation with 3 other potential investors over the past 2 years and had declined all of them, for reasons that ranged from unfavorable terms to what she described, with quiet precision, as men who were not prepared to deal with her as an equal. That last phrase she delivered without heat, as a simple statement of fact. He found he did not argue with it. He also learned in the course of those 3 hours that she was smarter than he had expected, which was saying something because he had expected her to be very smart. She had kept meticulous ledger records going back 4 years, tracking not just income and expenses, but weather patterns, grass conditions, cattle health outcomes tied to specific management decisions. She had been running experiments with her breeding stock that were ahead of what most Kansas ranchers were thinking about by at least a decade. When he pointed that out, she did not smile in the way that people smile when they want to be thanked for something. She simply said, "I have a long view of this land." He believed her. By the time the sun was getting low and Rosa had appeared in the doorway to say supper was ready, they had agreed on 23%, a 5-year term, operational independence completely in her hands, and quarterly reporting to the investors that she would prepare herself. She had insisted on preparing it herself, and he had not objected because he could see, from the ledger books on the table, that her record-keeping was more thorough than anything his investors would have produced on their own. "Will you stay for supper?" she asked, and the invitation was offered in the same tone she had used for every number in the negotiation, straightforward and without ornament. "Thank you," he said. "I would be glad to." Supper was beans and corn bread and roasted beef that was better than anything he had eaten in months, and he sat at the long table with Beatrice and Walt Briggs and the 3 hands, whose names were Jesse and Coop, and a young man named Thomas who could not have been more than 19 and who ate with the focused enthusiasm of someone who had been working since before dawn. Rosa ate in the kitchen, as was her custom, and Tobias made a point of stopping at the kitchen doorway before he left to thank her for the meal, which earned him a look of surprised approval from Rosa, and when he turned back to the table, a brief assessing glance from Beatrice that he noted but did not remark upon. After supper, Walt and the hands went to the bunkhouse, and Beatrice and Tobias sat on the porch in the blue falling dark, drinking coffee. And for the first time all day, there was no business being conducted, and he was curious to see what she would do with that. What she did was look out at the land and say, with something in her voice that was quieter than the voice she had used all day, "My father built this from a single ox, a plow, and $200. He came here in 1866 when I was 15, and he spent the next 9 years making something out of grassland that everyone else said was good for nothing." "It shows," Tobias said. "The land is in excellent condition. That kind of grass coverage takes years of careful management." She looked at him. "Most people who come here to talk about investment do not look at the grass." "I grew up on a farm in Ohio," he said, "before I moved to Missouri and got into cattle." "You learn to read land before you learn anything else." "Ohio," she said. "It was not quite a question. Tuscarawas County. My family had a grain farm. I came west when I was 22 because I needed more horizon." She turned back to look at the darkening plain where the first stars were appearing above the flat southern edge of the sky. "That I understand," she said. He stayed that night in the small room that the ranch kept for guests, which was sparse but clean. And in the morning he rode with her along the south fence line because she was continuing the work from the day before, and he wanted to see the full extent of the property. She did not invite him along so much as simply not tell him not to come, and he took that as permission enough. They rode for most of the morning, mostly in silence, which was comfortable in the way that silences are only comfortable between people who do not feel the need to fill the air with noise to prove something. Occasionally she would point out a feature of the land and explain a decision she had made about grazing rotation or water access. And occasionally he would ask a question, and the questions he asked were good ones that got to the heart of what she was actually describing, and he could see that she noticed this. At noon they stopped by the creek in the shade of the cottonwoods and ate the biscuits and dried beef that Rosa had packed for them, and she pulled off her hat and let the creek wind move through her hair, and she looked, for a moment, entirely different from the woman who had sat across the negotiating table from him the day before. Not less certain of herself, but less armored. "You are not like the other investors who have come through," she said. "How so?" She thought about it. "The others came with plans. With ideas about what this place should become, with suggestions." She said the last word with a dry edge. "You ask questions more than you suggest." "That is because it is your operation," he said. "I do not know this land the way you do. It would be foolish to pretend otherwise." She looked at him for a long moment. "The men in this county think I am too proud." "I have heard something to that effect," he said, and did not attempt to soften it. She did not seem offended. "What do you think after a day and a half?" He considered carefully before he answered. "I think you have earned the right to be proud of this place. I think there may be a difference between pride that comes from genuine achievement and pride that becomes a wall. I cannot yet tell which kind yours is." She was quiet for a moment. Then something crossed her face that might have been the beginning of a smile, though it did not quite arrive. "That is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in some time," she said. He rode back to Caldwell that afternoon with the signed preliminary agreement in his coat pocket, and a feeling in his chest that he recognized, distantly and somewhat inconveniently, as the beginning of something that had nothing to do with cattle investment. He returned to Wichita, presented the agreement to his investors, and spent the next 3 weeks handling the formal contract documentation and the transfer of the first installment of capital. The whole time he was in Wichita, he was thinking about the ranch south of Caldwell, about the way the grass moved in the wind, and the way Beatrice Hawkins had spoken about her father building something from nothing. He was thinking about the blue falling dark on the porch and the coffee cooling in their cups and the comfortable silence. He returned to the Hawkins ranch in early June, ostensibly to deliver the signed contract in person and to discuss the initial phase of herd expansion, which was the stated purpose of his visit. He brought with him a letter from Edmund Fisk confirming the capital transfer and a set of blank quarterly reporting forms that his investors had requested, though he suspected she would ignore the forms and prepare her own, which she did. Walt Briggs met him at the gate again, and this time, after 6 weeks, something in the old foreman's face was slightly less suspicious. He led Tobias to the house and knocked on the door, and when Beatrice opened it, she looked at Tobias for a moment with an expression that he found impossible to read, and then stepped back to let him in. She was wearing a different dress than the work clothes she had been in before, a plain blue cotton that was still utterly practical but was clearly not a dress for fence mending. And her hair was down rather than caught at the back of her neck, and these details registered in Tobias's mind with a sharpness that he was aware was not strictly professional. They went through the contract line by line at the oak table, and she had 3 specific questions about the liability clauses that were sharp and legally precise, and that he could only partially answer because they required confirmation from the lawyers in Wichita, which he told her honestly. She took notes in her ledger while he spoke and wrote down the questions, and told him she would expect written clarification from the attorneys within 30 days, which he told her was entirely reasonable. Then the business was done and Rosa appeared with coffee and a plate of fried apple slices dusted with cinnamon, and the afternoon opened up around them. "I have been thinking about what you said," she said, pouring the coffee. "I have said a fair number of things," he replied. "About pride. About the difference between earned pride and a wall." She set down the coffee pot and looked at him directly. "I have been thinking about it because no one has put it to me quite that way before." "What conclusions have you reached?" "That you were not wrong to leave it as an open question," she said. "I am not sure of the answer myself." He thought that was one of the most honest things he had ever heard anyone say about themselves, and he told her so. She tilted her head slightly. "Are you always this direct, Mr. Norris?" "Generally," he said. "It saves a great deal of time." "It does," she agreed, "though it also has a way of making people uncomfortable." "Has it made you uncomfortable?" She considered. "No," she said, which is somewhat unusual. They talked all afternoon. Not about cattle or investment or contracts, but about things that 2 people who are becoming interested in each other talk about, their histories and their thoughts about the future, their opinions on the state of Kansas politics and the railroad expansion, and the strange particular beauty of the flat plains that most people who did not grow up with them could never quite see. He told her about Ohio and the decision to come west and the years in Missouri, before he had sold his farm and moved into the investment work. She told him about coming to Kansas as a young girl and growing up with the ranch as her whole world, about learning to read ledgers at her father's knee and learning to ride before she could properly walk, and learning over the years that the things she was good at were not always the things that the world expected or rewarded her for being good at. "People expected me to marry and let someone else run this place," she said, and there was no bitterness in her voice, just a flat statement of fact. "There were men who came around after my father died who were very clear, in their particular way, that they thought the correct solution to my situation was matrimony." "And what did you tell them?" "I told them that my situation did not require a solution and that they were welcome to continue east at their convenience," she said. He laughed, and the laugh surprised her. He could see that, and she looked at him with something that might have been pleasure, cautiously admitted. He stayed 3 days that visit, and each evening they sat on the porch after supper with the coffee cooling in their hands and talked in the blue Kansas dark. On the last evening, as he was preparing to leave in the morning, they sat in a longer silence than usual, and he was aware of how good that silence was, how unforced, and he thought about the men in the saloon in Caldwell who had warned him about her, and he thought that they had described the right quality in entirely the wrong terms. She was proud, That was true, but her pride was not the small, defensive kind that sealed a person off from the world. It was the kind that came from knowing exactly what she had built, and what it had cost, and exactly what she was willing to accept in relation to it. It was the kind of pride that required the world to meet her at a certain level rather than asking her to step down to wherever the world happened to be standing. He did not find that exhausting. He found it clarifying. He rode back to Caldwell the next morning, and this time he did not go directly east toward Wichita. He stopped at the general store and looked at the selection of books they had, which was not extensive but was not entirely barren, and he bought a copy of a collection of essays by Harriet Beecher Stowe that he had seen Beatrice looking at on the shelf in her main room, a worn copy that she had clearly read multiple times. The store had a newer edition with an essay he did not think the old copy contained, and he thought she might want it, and he wrapped it in brown paper and posted it from the Caldwell post office with a brief note that said, "For the long view, T. Norris." He did not know if she would appreciate it or find it presumptuous or simply set it aside. He mailed it anyway. 3 weeks later, when he was in Wichita dealing with the details of 2 other investment partnerships, he received a letter. It was written in a careful, steady hand on plain white paper, and it said, "The new essay is very good. The author writes about property rights in a way that will be useful to me in a particular conversation I intend to have with the county assessor in August. Thank you, B. Hawkins." He read it twice and then a third time and then folded it and put it in his desk drawer rather than the filing cabinet where he kept business correspondence. He was back at the Hawkins ranch in July, this time because the first shipment of breeding stock he had arranged with a supplier in Abilene was coming through Caldwell, and he wanted to be present when she received it to ensure everything was in order. But he also wanted to be there, which was a thing he was finding increasingly impossible to deny. The breeding bulls arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, and she walked through them with a calm, expert eye that told him she had already been studying the specifications and measurements he had sent in advance, and was comparing them to the actual animals with the thoroughness of someone who did not rely on other people's assessments when she could make her own. She found 2 animals that did not meet the specifications in their hindquarter development, and she told him clearly that she would not accept them as part of the purchase without a price reduction. He looked at the 2 animals. She was right. He wrote a note to the supplier immediately, and the price was adjusted before sundown. That evening, with the new stock settled in Walt, and the hands managing the integration with the existing herd, Tobias found himself sitting on the fence rail at the edge of the home pasture watching the last light go golden across the grass, and Beatrice came and sat beside him, not on the fence but on the top rail of the post, her boots hooked through the lower rail, and they watched the evening come down together. "July is my favorite month on this land," she said. "Why July?" "Because everything that was uncertain in the spring has either worked or it has not by July, and you know what you are working with. The cattle that made it through the spring are strong. The grass that established has established. By July you know the shape of your year." He thought about this. "I think I feel that way about people," he said. "After enough time you know the shape of what someone is." She turned to look at him. The last light was warm on her face and her eyes were very dark. "And what shape am I, Mr. Norris?" He met her gaze steadily. "Precisely what I thought you were after the first afternoon," he said, "which is why I have kept coming back." She was quiet for a moment, and the evening light deepened around them, and a night hawk went crying across the sky, and then she said, "I have wondered about that. Whether you came back as much for the investment as for—" She stopped. "As for what?" he said. She looked at the darkening pasture. "I am not sure I know how to finish that sentence without it sounding like something that might alarm you." "Try it," he said. She was quiet for another moment, and then she said, "I have not been a person who expected to find someone who talked to me the way you do, who asked the questions you ask. I had accepted that this was a particular kind of loneliness that went with the life I had chosen." It was the most openly vulnerable thing she had said to him in all the weeks he had known her, and he was aware of how much it had cost her to say it, how much it went against the grain of the self-sufficiency she wore as naturally as her work coat. "I told 3 men in the Caldwell saloon, on the day I first rode out here, that I had been looking for someone worth being proud beside," he said. "I meant it then, and I mean it more now." She looked at him and he looked at her, and in the long, failing light of a Kansas July evening something between them shifted into a new shape and settled there, and he thought, there it is. He did not kiss her that evening. He was a careful man, and she was a proud woman, and some things needed their proper time. But something had been said, and both of them knew it, and the knowing of it was enough for that evening. Through the rest of July and into August, he found reasons to return to the Hawkins ranch with a frequency that probably exceeded what strict business necessity would have required. He told himself that the investment was significant enough to warrant close attention, which was not entirely untrue. He brought quarterly projections and supplier correspondence, and a small matter regarding the county assessor's land survey that she needed his help navigating, because the assessor, a man named Pemberton, had taken a peculiar interpretation of the property boundary on the southeast corner that had the potential to reduce the taxable acreage of the ranch in a way that would eventually cost her money. The meeting with Pemberton was the first time Tobias saw clearly what the men in Caldwell had meant when they said Beatrice was proud to a fault, not because she was wrong, but because her absolute refusal to accommodate even the smallest error in the assessor's reasoning, delivered in her direct, uncompromising way, had the effect of making Pemberton defensive to the point of entrenchment. Tobias watched this from a chair in the corner of Pemberton's office in Caldwell and understood the dynamic immediately. Pemberton was not a dishonest man. He was simply a man who had made an error and could not find a graceful way to walk it back with a woman who was not offering him any face-saving latitude whatsoever. After they left the office, Beatrice was quiet for a moment and then said, "He will dig in now." "Probably," Tobias said, "because I did not soften it. Because you did not give him a way to be right while being wrong," he said. "There is a difference." She stopped walking and looked at him. "You think I should have?" "I think," he said carefully, "that sometimes you can be correct about the substance of a thing and still find a way to present it that makes it easier for the other person to arrive at your position without feeling that they are being marched there at gunpoint." She stared at him for a long moment with those dark, assessing eyes, and he held the look without retreating because he had meant it and he would not take it back just because she was looking at him that way. Then she said, "All right." That was all. Just those 2 words, but he understood that for Beatrice Hawkins, who had been completely right about everything for the better part of 3 years with no one around her willing to say otherwise, those 2 words represented something significant. They went back to Pemberton the following morning, and this time she said the same things in a different way, a way that acknowledged that land surveys were complex, and that reasonable men could arrive at different interpretations from the same data, while making absolutely clear that the data, properly interpreted, supported her position, and here was the documentation to prove it. Pemberton agreed to a reassessment within the week. The boundary was confirmed in her favor. Walking back from the assessor's office, she said, "I see the difference. It is not about being less right," he said. "It is about leaving a door open." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My father used to say something similar. I may not have fully understood what he meant until just now." He thought about Henry Hawkins, who had built something from nothing and had clearly raised his daughter to value that same quality of determination. And he thought that some of the pride that others found difficult was simply the shape that determination took in a person who had spent years being the only one in the room willing to hold the line. He did not think it was something she needed to unmake. He thought it was something she might find worth refining if she chose to, on her own terms. In September, the weather turned, and Tobias made what he fully acknowledged to himself was a personal visit rather than a business one. He rode out on a Saturday with no contract or ledger report in his saddlebag, and when he arrived in the yard, Walt Briggs looked at him, and then looked at the empty saddlebag hanging flat across Calhoun's rump and did not say anything, just jerked his head toward the house. She was on the porch when he rode in reading, and she lowered the book and looked at him coming across the yard, and something in her face eased in a way he had been noticing more and more in her presence, a particular quality of ease that he thought she probably did not show to many people. "Mr. Norris," she said. "Miss Hawkins," he said, "I have no business reason to be here today. I came because I wanted to." She looked at him for a moment, and then she said, "That is the first time you have said that plainly. I thought it was time. Come and sit down," she said. He sat on the porch beside her, and she showed him what she was reading, which was a survey of livestock management practices from the Missouri State Agricultural Society, annotated in the margins in her careful handwriting. And they talked about it for an hour in the way that two people talk about a subject when they are both genuinely interested in it, but are also using it as the ground to stand on while they work out something more personal. He told her about the experiments he had heard about in Texas regarding breeding selection for weather tolerance. She told him about the results she had been seeing from the bulls he had brought from Abilene, early results but encouraging. And then the conversation shifted, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with cattle at all, about what they wanted from the years ahead, about what a good life looked like from where each of them stood. He was 34, and he had been moving across the territory for 6 years, and he was beginning to want to stop moving. She was 28, and she had put down deep roots in this specific piece of Kansas earth, and she was beginning to wonder whether those roots could hold something more than the work. He looked at her on the porch in the September afternoon with the cottonwoods beginning to turn at the edge of the pasture, and he said, "I would like to court you properly, Beatrice, if you are willing. I am not asking you to be anything other than what you are. I am asking if you would like some company in it." She looked at him for a long time. He had the impression that no one had ever put it to her quite in those terms before, that the men who had previously expressed interest had come with expectations about what she would become rather than interest in what she already was. "I think I would," she said. "Yes." It was a careful, deliberate yes, the kind of yes that understood what it was committing to, and he thought it was the best kind. The courtship of Beatrice Hawkins and Tobias Norris proceeded through the autumn of 1878 with a pace and character that matched both of them, which is to say it was thoughtful and genuine, and not prone to unnecessary drama, though it was not without its difficulties. He rode out from Caldwell, where he had taken a room at the hotel on a more permanent basis, every week or 10 days. And they spent their time together in a combination of genuine work and genuine conversation that blurred together in a way that felt entirely natural. He helped her through the fall cattle work, which was the hardest season, and he learned quickly enough that helping Beatrice Hawkins meant doing what she asked in the way she asked it, and offering his own thoughts only when they were solicited, which required more patience than he had fully expected. He had grown up in a world where men moved first and thought later, and the habit of it died hard. But he learned to watch and wait and offer his ideas as questions rather than instructions, and he found that, when he did that, she actually listened to them and often incorporated them, and she was better at acknowledging when someone else had a good idea than the men in Caldwell had suggested. What they had said was true in one sense. She did not brook disagreement easily, but it was not exactly that she would not hear a different view. It was that she needed to be met with the same rigor she herself brought. If you came to her with a vague feeling that something should be different, she had no use for you. If you came to her with a specific, reasoned argument and the evidence to back it, she would listen and she would think and she would sometimes change her mind, and she would do so without fanfare or resentment. He found this, once he understood it, to be one of the things he admired most about her. Rosa, who had observed all of this from the kitchen with the particular attentiveness of someone who had known her employer since childhood, gave Tobias her approval in a characteristically oblique way, which was by simply beginning to serve him an extra portion at supper without being asked, which Walt Briggs told him, in a private moment, was as high an honor as Rosa bestowed. Walt Briggs himself thawed slowly, which was appropriate for a man who had watched over this operation and this woman for the better part of 4 years, and who was not about to approve of anyone quickly. In late October, after Tobias had spent a day helping with the work of sorting the herd for the fall, Walt came to him in the barn while he was unsaddling Calhoun and said, with the directness of a man who had earned the right to be direct, "She does not bend easily. You understand that?" "I do," Tobias said. "Most men who come around want her to." "I know that too." Walt looked at him for a long moment in the lantern light of the barn. "She told me you said you had been looking for someone worth being proud beside. She told me in that way she has when she is trying to sound like she is just reporting information, but she is actually telling you something matters to her." Tobias rubbed Calhoun down and said nothing because nothing seemed necessary. "I will say that is the right approach," Walt said. "A man who tries to make himself taller by making her smaller will not last a week." He paused, which she has proved several times over. He turned and walked out of the barn, and that was the end of the conversation, but Tobias understood that something had been said and meant. In November, he brought her something that was not a book and not anything practical, which was a risk he took deliberately. He had found in a shop in Wichita a small framed photograph, a landscape print of the Kansas plains taken by a traveling photographer from a high point on the Flint Hills, and he brought it to her wrapped in brown paper and sat with her while she opened it. She looked at it for a long moment in silence, and then she looked up at him, and something moved through her face that was unguarded in a way he had seen very rarely. "This is what it looks like from the ridge on the east section," she said. "The one I ride out to when I need to think. I thought it might be," he said. She looked at the photograph again, and then she looked at him and she said, with a simplicity and a lack of performance that moved him, "Thank you, Tobias." It was the first time she had called him by his first name without a formal occasion requiring it, and he noted it with a quiet feeling that settled into his chest and stayed there. In December, he asked her to marry him. He did not plan a speech. He had thought about what he wanted to say for several weeks, and he had concluded that the only approach that would be right for her was the honest and direct one, because anything else would be a kind of condescension, a belief that she needed to be moved by rhetoric when what she responded to was truth. He asked her on the porch on a cold December afternoon, with the sky going the color of pewter and the first hint of snow in the air, and he said, "I want to spend my life with you. Not to manage your land or run your ranch or tell you what your pride should look like. I want to be next to you while you do it. I think you are the most capable and honest person I have met in my life, and I find that I cannot imagine the future without you in it. Will you marry me?" She was quiet for a long time, and he let her be quiet because he knew she needed to think and he trusted her thinking. Then she said, "I need you to understand something. Tell me. I will not give this ranch to a husband. This land is mine and it will remain mine, and I will run it as I have always run it. I am not unwilling to share my life. I am not willing to surrender it." "I know that," he said. "I never asked you to." She looked at him. "Most men would not be comfortable with that arrangement." "I am not most men," he said. "And for what it is worth, I would be a poor partner in your operation if I were always underfoot. I have my own work to do. You would stay in Caldwell, continue the investment work. I would be based here. This would be my home if you'll have me in it. But yes, I would continue the work. It is what I am good at." She thought about this. He could see her thinking, weighing it against some internal standard that he respected even when he could not see its full shape. "Yes," she said at last. "Yes, Tobias, I will marry you." He took her hand, which was work-roughened and strong, and she let him hold it, and they sat in the cold December afternoon watching the pewter sky and holding hands on the porch of the ranch she had built, and it was one of the better moments of his life. They were married in March of 1879 at the small church in Caldwell, which was a plain frame building that managed, on that particular morning, to look entirely adequate for the occasion. Beatrice wore a dress of dark green wool that she had made herself over the winter, practical and beautiful in the same breath. And her hair was done up in the way she wore it on formal occasions, and she walked into that church as she walked into every room, with the particular sureness of someone who had decided to be there and meant it. Rosa came and wept openly throughout the ceremony and declared afterward that it was a very good thing because she had not been sure Beatrice would ever stop being stubborn long enough to let someone in, which made Beatrice raise her chin in the way she did when she was being called out, and then, after a moment, lower it and say, "You are probably right." Walt Briggs wore his good jacket and shook Tobias's hand with a grip that communicated a complete sentence without needing words, something along the lines of, "I am trusting you with something that matters more than you can know." Edmund Fisk came from Wichita and sat in the back of the church with a particular expression of a man who had unknowingly started something much larger than he intended when he wrote a letter of introduction. The hands, Jesse and Coop and young Thomas, cleaned up and sat together and looked moderately uncomfortable in their good clothes and largely unfamiliar surroundings, which was an expression they shared with most of the other attendees. After the ceremony, there was a dinner at the church hall, and then they rode south together to the ranch in the clear March afternoon, Tobias on Calhoun and Beatrice on her gray mare, Constance, riding side by side on the two-track road, with the Kansas plain opening around them in every direction, and the first green of spring just beginning to show in the grass. He moved his things into the ranch house gradually over the following weeks, fitting himself into the space with care, and without displacing anything that was hers, which was a process that required more thought than he had expected, and which she watched with an attention that he understood was not suspicious so much as careful. She was making room, not surrendering room, and there was a difference. He set up his own work in a corner of the spare room that became his office, where he dealt with his investment correspondence and the ongoing business relationships he maintained across the territory. He did not involve himself in the running of the ranch without being asked, though he was always willing to lend a hand when the work required it, and he never offered an opinion on how she managed things unless she specifically solicited it, which she began to do more often as the months passed, not always in a formal way, but in the way of a person who has learned that a particular kind of conversation is available and has grown to value it. She solicited it, for instance, on a late spring morning in May when she came to his office doorway and said, "I am thinking about expanding the north pasture. There is adjacent land that could be acquired. I would like your opinion on the financial structure." He set down his pen and said, "Show me the parcel," and they spent the afternoon walking the north boundary of her property and looking at the land in question, and he told her what he thought, which was that the land was good but the asking price was somewhat high given the current cattle market, and he thought she could negotiate it down by waiting until fall when the market would likely soften. She disagreed, thought the land would be taken by someone else before fall, and they had the first real argument of their marriage standing in the May grass on the north boundary of the Hawkins ranch, both of them speaking directly and without giving quarter. He thought she was being impatient. She thought he was being overly cautious. They went back to the house and continued the argument over supper, and then talked it through more carefully afterward with the ledger books on the table, and she showed him, with her characteristic meticulousness, why she thought the risk of losing the parcel to another buyer outweighed the financial benefit of waiting, and he showed her, with the market data he had from Wichita, why he thought the risk was smaller than she calculated. They went to bed without having settled it, and in the morning he woke to find her already at the table with a fresh sheet of paper working through the numbers again, and he sat down across from her with his coffee and looked at what she had written, and after 20 minutes he said, "You are right. The north parcel is worth moving on now." She looked up from her paper. "What changed?" "I looked at your buyer timeline, and I think I underestimated how quickly that parcel will move. Your calculation on that is better than mine, because you know this county, and I do not know it as well as you do." She looked at him for a moment and then she said, "And I think I underweighted the market softening argument. Not enough to change the conclusion, but I should have given it more credit." This was how their disagreements went generally. They were real disagreements, with real stakes and real emotion, and neither of them backed down from a position simply to preserve peace. But they both followed the evidence and neither of them needed to win more than they needed to be right, and there was a difference. They acquired the North Parcel in June of 1879 for a price that was, as it turned out, almost exactly what Beatrice had predicted. The investment partnership continued to perform well through the first year, the breeding stock from Abilene producing results in the fall weigh-in that exceeded the projected returns, which meant that the investors in Wichita and Kansas City were pleased, and Tobias's position with them was strengthened. He was able to negotiate, in the renewal discussions that began that winter, a reduction in the profit percentage from 23 to 18, which Beatrice accepted with the calm satisfaction of a woman who had known the business would justify a renegotiation in her favor if she ran it correctly. In the winter of 1879, they learned that Beatrice was expecting their first child, news which she delivered to Tobias with the same directness she brought to everything, sitting across from him at the breakfast table and saying, "I am going to have a baby in June. I thought you should know." He put down his coffee cup and looked at her and felt something expand in his chest. "How are you feeling?" "At the moment, entirely fine. Ask me again in 2 months." A pause. "I am not going to stop working." "I did not imagine you would. I want to be clear about that. Beatrice," he said, "I know who I married." Something shifted in her face at that, a softening that still moved him every time he saw it because it was so specifically reserved for moments when she felt fully known. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Rosa was so pleased by the news that she made 3 separate celebratory meals in consecutive days, and had to be gently restrained from beginning to sew baby clothes before the calendar turned to spring. Walt Briggs said very little, as was his custom, but Tobias noticed that the old foreman began quietly redistributing the heavier work away from any task that Beatrice might take on in the spring months, doing it in a way that required no acknowledgement and would have been difficult for her to object to, because it did not look like accommodation so much as simple good management. She noticed anyway because she noticed everything, and she said to Tobias one evening, "Walt is adjusting the spring work schedule on my account." "I know," Tobias said. "I have not decided how I feel about that. I think he is doing it the way he is so you do not have to have a conversation about it that would require you to either accept help in a way you find uncomfortable or refuse it in a way you would regret," Tobias said. She thought about this. "That is a very particular kind of loyalty." "Walt Briggs has been watching out for you for a long time," Tobias said, "in the ways that were available to him." She was quiet and then she said, "Yes." Another pause. "I should tell him I am grateful." "He already knows. I should tell him anyway." She did the next morning. In the brief practical way she expressed most personal things, which was to walk up to Walt at the beginning of the workday and say, "I see what you are doing with the spring schedule and I am grateful for your thought." And Walt had said, with the brevity that matched her own, "That is what I am here for." And that had been the entire conversation, and both of them had understood it completely. Their son was born in June of 1880, in the bedroom of the ranch house, delivered by a midwife named Mrs. Haverford, who came out from Caldwell and who said afterward that Beatrice Hawkins Norris was the most controlled and deliberate person she had ever attended in that particular capacity, which was both a compliment and possibly also a mild criticism. Beatrice named the boy Henry for her father, and the choice was made quietly and without announcement, and when Tobias heard the name he sat with it for a moment and then said, "That is exactly right," and meant it. Henry Norris came into the world with his mother's dark eyes and his father's broader forehead, and from the first days he seemed to possess the particular quality of attention, that focused, unhurried readiness to look at whatever was in front of him and understand it, that both his parents shared, and Rosa said this was a very good sign, and also that he was the most beautiful baby she had ever seen, which she said every time, and which everyone always believed in the moment regardless. Fatherhood settled on Tobias with a naturalness that surprised him in its depth. He had not known, before Henry arrived, how much room there was in a person for this kind of love, the particular overwhelming quality of it, the way it reorganized everything around a new center without requiring him to give up anything he had been before. He held his son in the evenings and watched Beatrice across the room and thought about the men in the Caldwell saloon and the letter in his coat pocket and the long road south through the Kansas grass and all the steps between that first arrival in the yard and this present moment. And the chain of it seemed to him both improbable and inevitable in equal measure. Beatrice took to motherhood as she took to everything, with complete commitment and without sentimentality. She nursed Henry herself and held him with the same capable hands that drove fence posts and managed ledger books, and she talked to him in the same direct, thoughtful way she talked to everyone, explaining things to him, while he was still too young to understand them in the apparent conviction that the habit of explanation was worth establishing early. Tobias would find her at the edge of the east pasture with Henry on her hip, pointing at something in the distance and saying, "That is the draw where the grass grows longest because the water from the spring runs under the ground and surfaces there in July. Your grandfather knew that before he put the east fence in, and he placed the fence to include that section on purpose." Henry could not have been more than 4 months old at the time, but he looked in the direction she was pointing with an expression of concentrated attention that made Tobias, watching from the fence, feel something catch in his chest. The years that followed were full years. The ranch grew with the north parcel, and then with a second acquisition on the west side in 1882. And the investment partnership was renewed twice with terms that continued to improve in Beatrice's favor as the operations track record strengthened. Tobias managed his investment work from the ranch, which had become a center of operations for a portfolio that now included 4 other spreads across Sumner County and into the Oklahoma Territory, and he rode to Caldwell twice a week, and to Wichita perhaps once a month for meetings. But he came home every time, and the word home had acquired a specific physical weight that it had not had in the years of his moving. Walt Briggs aged into a kind of sage status on the property, stepping back gradually from the hardest physical work as the years accumulated without ever fully retiring, because retirement was a concept that did not seem applicable to a man like Walt. He spent more time with young Henry, once the boy was old enough to be interesting, teaching him the practical vocabulary of the ranch, the names of things and the reasons for them, the logic of cattle management and fence maintenance and water management that he had accumulated over decades. Henry absorbed it with the same focused, unhurried attention he had always shown, and by the time he was 5, he was asking questions that surprised even Walt. Rosa remained in the kitchen and the life of the household with the permanence of something that had always been there and would always be there. Her cooking and her particular brand of loving, outspoken care, the steady warm current that ran underneath the harder practical business of the place. She had a nephew in Caldwell, a young man named Miguel who came out sometimes to help with heavy work, and in 1883 he married the daughter of one of the neighboring ranchers, and both Rosa and Beatrice attended the wedding and came home talking about it in their respective ways, Rosa tearfully and at length, Beatrice briefly and specifically. In the spring of 1883, Beatrice told Tobias at breakfast that she was expecting again. He received this news with the same feeling as the first time, that particular expansion in the chest, and said, "Henry will be glad to have a companion." Henry was almost 3 by then, and had recently entered a phase of focused, demanding curiosity that required more conversational engagement than even 2 attentive parents could always supply. The second child, a daughter, arrived in October of 1883, which was harvest time on the ranch, and therefore the worst possible timing from a purely logistical standpoint, which Beatrice acknowledged with a dry practicality that made Mrs. Haverford, attending again, bite back a laugh. They named her Clara, a name that had been Beatrice's mother's name, and she arrived into the world with a set of lungs that made her opinion of it immediately and unambiguously clear. Clara Norris was, from the beginning, a different creature from her brother in ways that fascinated both her parents. Where Henry was quiet and observant and approached new things with careful assessment, Clara approached them with immediate, enthusiastic engagement and an absolute confidence in her own ability to manage whatever she encountered. By the time she was 2, she was following Walt Briggs around the yard with a seriousness of purpose that he met with patient courtesy and occasionally genuine awe. "She reminds me of someone," Tobias said to Beatrice one evening, watching Clara inform Walt of something with considerable emphasis from the fence rail she had climbed herself. "Do not say it," Beatrice said, but the corner of her mouth was doing something that was close to a smile. "I was going to say she reminds me of your father," Tobias said. "From the stories you have told." She looked at him. "That is a better answer," she said, "and probably true." A pause. "Though the other thing you were going to say is also probably true." He laughed, and she let her own smile complete itself, and they stood together in the late afternoon, watching their daughter issue directives to a 60-year-old foreman, who accepted them with a gravity they arguably deserved. The troubles that came in the mid-1880s came to most ranches in Kansas, and the Hawkins operation was not immune to them. The winter of 1884 was brutal, one of the hardest on record, with temperatures that drove cattle through weak fences and into draws where they were found in the spring half frozen and thin. Beatrice lost 40 head that winter, which was a smaller number than most of her neighbors lost but was still a blow, and the spring recovery work was the hardest Tobias could remember on the place. He worked beside her through all of it, through the fence repairs in the bitter cold and the spring branding and the long days of assessing the condition of the surviving herd. They were tired in the evenings in a way that went down to the bone, and there were nights when supper was quiet and brief, and they went to bed early and lay in the dark and talked in low voices about what needed doing the next day. It was on one of those nights, in March of 1884, with the wind still cold outside the window and Henry asleep in his room and Clara, who was 4 months old, sleeping in her cradle near the bedroom wall, that Beatrice said quietly into the dark, "I am glad you are here." He turned toward her. "Where else would I be?" "No," she said. "I mean, I am glad you are specifically here in the way that you are here, not managing things or trying to fix things, just here." He understood what she meant. "So am I," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that he suspected cost her the last remnant of the armor that she had worn for so many years before he came. "When my father died, I thought that this land was all the company I needed. I thought the work was enough." She paused. "I was wrong about that." He put his arm around her, and she settled against him in the dark, and the wind moved outside, and Clara breathed her small, steady breath from the cradle, and he thought that it was possible to be exactly where you were supposed to be. The ranch recovered from the hard winter as strong operations do, slowly and by hard work and sound management. The spring of 1885 brought good rain and good grass, and the cattle that had survived the winter were in excellent condition by summer, and the breeding program that Beatrice had been running for 7 years was producing results that were becoming known beyond Sumner County. She was approached that year by a rancher from the Cherokee Strip who wanted to purchase breeding stock from her, and she met with him at the ranch and negotiated the sale with the same clear efficiency she brought to all business dealings. Tobias watched the meeting from the doorway of his office and thought, as he often did, that she was the best negotiator he had ever encountered, not because she was hard but because she was precise, because she came to every transaction knowing exactly what she had, what it was worth, and what she would and would not accept. And that knowledge, grounded in genuine mastery of her subject, was something no amount of bluster or strategy could overcome. By the autumn of 1885, the operation had fully recovered from the hard winter, and then some. The North and West acquisitions were producing. The herd was larger and of better quality than it had ever been, and the investment partnership, in its 8th year, was performing well enough that the investors were discussing an expansion into a 3rd location, a conversation that Tobias was managing with his usual combination of careful assessment and clear communication. He was 41 that autumn, and Beatrice was 35, and they had been married for 6 years, and the life they had built together on the Kansas plain had a solidity and a richness that he would not have been able to fully imagine in those earlier years of his moving. He had been looking for something without knowing precisely what it was, a word or a shape for what he needed, and he had found it not in a piece of land but in a particular kind of partnership with a particular kind of person, and the correctness of that finding had only deepened with time. On a September afternoon in 1885, with Henry 5 years old and beginning to show the first signs of the serious, thoughtful character he would carry all his life, and Clara not quite 2, and as determined and vocal as ever, Tobias saddled Calhoun and rode with Beatrice out to the East Ridge, her particular thinking place that she had mentioned to him before they were married, and that had become, over the years, a place they rode together sometimes. It was the highest point on the property, a long, gradual swell of land from which you could see for miles in every direction. The entire Hawkins ranch spread below them in the late afternoon light, the home buildings small and precise in the middle distance, the cattle moving slow and dark across the pastures, the windmill turning, the cottonwoods along the creek just beginning their autumn turn. She sat Constance beside Calhoun on the ridge, and they looked out at all of it, and the sky above the southern plain was the particular shade of late September blue that belonged to this specific latitude and time of year, deep and clear, and without bottom. "This is what my father saw when he came here," she said, "when he was standing on this ridge the first time with nothing but an ox and $200 and the whole thing ahead of him. What do you think he would say about it now?" Tobias asked. She looked at the land for a long time. "I think he would say that it is exactly what it was supposed to become," she said, "and I think," she paused, "I think he would have liked you." "I hope so," Tobias said. He valued people who spoke plainly and did what they said they would do. She turned to look at him. "He would have appreciated that you have never once tried to make this smaller than it is. You have only ever tried to make it larger." He met her eyes. "That is because it deserved to be larger," he said, "and so did you." She held his gaze in the way she did when she was receiving something and allowing herself to feel the weight of it rather than immediately moving past it, a quality she had developed gradually through their years together, the ability to let something simply land. "I was told you were proud to a fault," he said. "Before I met you, multiple people told me." "I know," she said. "What did you say?" "I said I had been looking for someone worth being proud beside." She looked at him for a long moment on the high ridge in the September afternoon, with the whole of what they had built between them spread below. "And," she said, "and I was right," he said, "about all of it." She reached across the space between their horses and took his hand, her work-roughened, capable hand that he had known for 7 years and still found remarkable, and they sat on the ridge in the late afternoon light and looked out at the land and did not say anything more for a long while, because nothing more was required. The years that followed added themselves to the Norris life with the steady accumulation of things genuinely lived. Henry grew into a boy of serious purpose and genuine kindness, who spent his after-school hours in the company of either Walt or his father learning the respective vocabularies of ranching and business, and who read everything he could get his hands on, with the focused appetite his mother had shown at the same age. He was quiet in the way of people who are taking everything in, and he was thoughtful in the way of people who say things they mean. And by the time he was 10, it was clear that he would eventually be capable of running the ranch with the same standard his mother had set. Clara grew into herself with the force of something that had always known exactly what it was. She was quick and sure and fiercely interested in everything, with a voice and a certainty of opinion that turned heads even when she was barely old enough to reach the table. And Beatrice watched her daughter with a particular expression that was equal parts recognition and something more complicated, a mother's understanding of the cost of being that kind of person in a world that did not always make room for it. She told Clara from early on and in many different ways that being certain of yourself was not a liability, that the world would sometimes tell her it was, but that the world was wrong about that, though it was worth learning the difference between certainty and inflexibility, because only one of those was actually useful. Rosa finally retired from the kitchen in 1889, when she was in her 60s and her knees had decided that they had given enough. Beatrice helped her into a small house in Caldwell near her nephew Miguel and his family, and visited her every week without fail for the rest of the years Rosa had, which turned out to be many more years than anyone had expected because Rosa, as it turned out, was not a woman who diminished easily. She continued to give her opinions on everything in Beatrice's life, and to receive weekly reports on the children with the proprietary interest of someone who regarded herself as their second grandmother, which she essentially was. The replacement cook was a capable woman named Adeline who came from a ranch family in the Oklahoma Territory, and who understood the particular requirements of cooking for a working ranch, which was to say, she cooked large quantities of good food, and did not require anyone to make conversation about it. Walt Briggs finally stepped back from active foreman duties in 1890, at some age that no one was quite certain of because Walt had never seen fit to discuss it, and accepted a room in the main house with a particular grace that managed to be both completely Walt and surprisingly touching. He was still consulted about everything. He consulted himself about most things without being asked. He taught Henry and Clara what he knew in the same practical, unornamented way he had always taught everything, and on the evenings when he sat on the porch with Tobias after supper and said nothing for an hour at a time, it was the best kind of nothing. In the spring of 1891, Beatrice and Tobias sat together at the oak table that had been there since before he came, and that had accumulated over the years a particular patina of use and decision. And she showed him the ledger she had been keeping for 13 years, and they looked at what the numbers said. They said that the Hawkins Ranch, which had become in practice if not in formal name the Hawkins Norris operation, was one of the strongest cattle operations in southern Kansas. The herd was at its largest and its best quality. The land was in exceptional condition. The investment partnership, which had run its 5-year cycles through multiple renewals, had paid returns that had satisfied everyone, and had also, through those returns, allowed Beatrice to buy out a portion of the investor interest, so that more of the profit stayed on the ranch. She now owned 82% of her own operation, up from 100% before the investment, but in a category of financial strength that the pre-investment operation could never have achieved alone. "Your father would say exactly what he said," Tobias said, looking at the numbers. "That it is exactly what it was supposed to become," she agreed. He closed the ledger and looked at her across the table. She was 41 now, and she was still exactly the person she had been when he had ridden into this yard 13 years ago, only more so, more fully and completely herself in the way that time does to people when they have been living the right life. The directness was still entirely there, and the capability was still entire, and the particular quality of her pride had remained what it had always been at its best, not a wall but a standard, a thing she held up and kept, and invited those who were worthy to hold beside her. He was 47, and he had no desire to be anywhere that was not this specific place with this specific woman, and the simplicity of that certainty was something he had never quite gotten used to, and hoped he never would. "I want to do something," she said, and there was something in her voice that was different, careful in a new way. "Tell me." "I want to put the ranch formally in both our names," she said. "Legally. The Hawkins Norris Ranch." He was quiet for a moment. He understood how much this meant. She had held this land under her own name through everything, had built it under her own name, and her name on this land was not just a legal fact but a statement of everything she had built and everything she was. The offer of his name alongside it was not a concession. It was a choice. "Beatrice," he started. "It is mine to give," she said clearly. "I am not surrendering it. I am including you in it because you belong in it." A pause. "You have been building this with me for 13 years, Tobias. You belong in the name." He reached across the oak table and took her hand, and she let him hold it. And outside the window the Kansas plain went on and on under the spring sky. And somewhere in the house, Henry was reading and Clara was certainly doing something with the focused intensity she brought to all activities. And in the barn the horses were in their stalls and the cattle were in the pastures and the windmill was turning above it all in the morning wind. "All right," he said. "Yes." She nodded, and something in her settled in the way of something that has been held a long time finally being set down in the right place. "Good," she said. "Now come and look at the north fence survey. I think we can extend the west boundary by another quarter section if we move on it before summer." He laughed, which was the right response, and they got up from the table together and went outside into the spring morning and stood side by side on the porch of the ranch that was theirs, looking out at the land that went on forever under the Kansas sky, and the world was exactly as wide and as good as it needed to be. Henry, at 11, was already talking about the breeding program with a specificity that told his parents he would be running it better than either of them within 10 years. Clara, at 8, had already decided that she would study law, a declaration she made at supper one evening with the absolute conviction she brought to all declarations, and which her parents met, after a brief exchange of glances, with complete seriousness, Beatrice saying, "You will need a very thorough education for that," and Tobias saying, "We will make sure you have it." And Clara had nodded in the manner of someone who had simply confirmed what she already knew. They were a family that understood the value of what they had made because they had made it themselves, and they were a partnership in every sense of the word. Two people who had found each other on a Kansas plain and had built something that was more than either of them had planned, not by becoming the same thing, but by being different things that fit together exactly as they were, proud beside each other in the best possible sense, which was the right sense, which was the only sense that had ever really mattered. The land went on, and the windmill turned, and the cattle grazed on the thick spring grass, and the house held all of them in its frame walls with the practical, unornamented strength of something built to last, and the two-track road that had once led a man from Wichita south through the golden rolling Kansas plain was the same road now that led home.